List videos are usually something I find lazy and clickbaity, but I find myself being a bit of a hypocrite lately, so here we are. It's the end of a year filled with top-tier game releases, and despite my best efforts, I can't think of any way to celebrate that other than to make a top 5 list. Here's the criteria. The game has to have been released in North America, that's where I live, in 2017. If I didn't beat it, I've had to have at least played a significant representation of it. Unfortunately, this eliminates a decent amount of games. It needs a reason beyond this list other than I liked it, or the graphics were shiny, or the gameplay was good. This also eliminates a decent amount of games. In no particular order, here are the games I think made an impact this year. They're not necessarily perfect, but they're all good games and they're all important, and I think will be remembered for a long time. Persona 5 improves on its predecessors in every way possible, from the art style, the music, the level design, to the main character having an actual backstory. While I somewhat understandably haven't finished the game, it's been a great ride so far with many interesting narrative devices used. The combat remains pretty much the same as in 3 and 4, but with more focus on the lesser used elemental attacks instead of the usual fire, wind, electricity, and ice. Elements like nuclear make their return from the earlier games that nobody played. In fact, 2 used to be my favorite in this series, but 5 is a pretty strong contender. Now I just have to finish it and see how the rest plays out. One of the first videos I made on this channel was an initial impressions video about the feeling of loneliness and isolation that the game does an excellent job of portraying. So, while I can go on for a while, I'll just leave a link to that in the top right of this video instead. Horizon Zero Dawn is somehow both every open world cliché pitfall and something completely innovative at the same time. The world is littered with collectibles and diversions, and you can spend hours without even touching the main quest. That's not always a good thing in many games. I'm looking at you, Assassin's Creed. But getting collectibles here gives you lore, it gives you insight into how what seems like a primitive world is actually a far post-apocalyptic one. It gives you poems. Your ability to take control over your enemy robots is completely dependent on whether or not you stumbled into the right ruins and gained that ability. Random exploration has a purpose, a tangible benefit, and that's something that many open world games are lacking without it being shoehorned in like item drops for upgrades. More on that in a little bit though. One final thing about the setting is that it's both varied in terms of environment, going from ice-covered mountains to dusty mesas, and the amount of civilization that is left over from the before times. You can see the ruins of old collapsed buildings and broken highways and train tracks. It's possibly the most varied game world I've seen other than the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind, where one city is carved out of a giant crab shell, another is built out of and on top of giant mushrooms, and its capital consists of 4 golden pyramids and a meteor perpetually held back in the sky by a physical god. Yeah, there's a reason Morrowind exploded before Skyrim happened. The combat is something unlike any other game, even though at times it can feel like Uncharted or the rebooted Tomb Raiders with a stealth until it inevitably fails kind of approach. The difference, however, lies in your arsenal. Most of your weapons are tools rather than damage dealers. Use the rope caster to tie enemies down. Use the tripwire to set a trap and shock them into submission while you run away to regroup. Use the terror blaster to rip away armor and then go in for the kill. Override robot enemies and have them distract and damage your foes. In any case, your regular bow and spear don't cut it at higher levels, and it requires a more cerebral approach, almost feeling like an RPG, taking elemental damage, type weaknesses, and status effects into account. I think this, along with her focus ability that lets her see the unseen, is what makes the gameplay so unique, and I don't use that term loosely. The story is very well written, particularly the dialogue. Even the random side quests make me want to help the people in need, and they have personalities instead of, "Hello, fellow adventurer." There's a feeling of urgency with some of them, and when you return their ancestral spear or whatever for them, there's no expectation of getting the spear in return for helping them, like with pretty much any other game. The characters are very well developed, and even after talking to them once or twice, you could get a feel for their entire character. It's great. Yakuza is a series that has a huge amount of mood whiplash, and Zero takes it to a whole new level. In the first scene, you're beating a guy to a pulp in an alley for not paying back his loans, and a few hours later, you're assigning definitely not Michael Jackson and a chicken to run your real estate businesses. It's almost like there are two halves to this game, the part that takes place in linear corridors and cutscenes, and the part that's made up of weird side quests and mini-games. I have one massive complaint about Yakuza 0, and that's that there is an unforgivable amount of grinding about 3/4 of the way through the game. It's not fighting, it's literally just time wasting. So, you switch between the two main characters, Kiryu and Majima. You upgrade their stats with money. In the early game, you can earn upgrades just by fighting random people. But eventually, the cost for a single upgrade goes from 40,000 yen to 10 billion. You can make money through Kiryu's real estate minigame thing and Majima's hostess club minigame. The problem is, Kiryu makes way more for less time and effort. TLDR, you can transfer a very limited amount between characters, but for Kiryu, you need to buy businesses and hire employees, and it takes time for the money to build up before it pays out. This often amounts to just literally wandering around doing nothing, waiting for your money to come in so you can upgrade your characters. For 12 hours in my case, and I still didn't get anywhere near all the upgrades. That mess aside, it's an amazing game with a story that takes twists and turns at every corner, and anytime you think to yourself, this plot makes no sense, someone in the game calls it out or clarifies what's going on behind the scenes. Unlike the rest of the series, you can go in without playing any of the other games, and I would actually say it's better off that way, because a ton of characters have time paradox plot armor. And some of those characters who you've never heard of before, you might have not heard of them for a reason. This could be considered the origin story of the two main characters. How did Kiryu go from a peon to the Dragon of Dojima? And how did Majima go from a calm and collected guy in a suit to the snakeskin psychopath that everyone knows and loves? There are good answers for both here, and well done and not at all fan servicey donning the cape moments. The story's the biggest attraction here, with probably the most coherent plot in the series, though that's not saying much. But the gameplay is also great, with 4 vastly different fighting styles for each character. Combat never gets dull, especially boss fights, which are more dynamic than ever. And while I won't spoil too much, you'll grow to hate one recurring boss with a passion. There's always a lot of lieutenants of captains of the family of the clan consortiums going around, but you'll remember that name. If you have a PS4, or speak very fluent Japanese and have a PS3, this is one game you should definitely give a chance to if you have the slightest interest in something like The Godfather or any mafia movie where the honorable ones are a dying breed. Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice is the game that proved that not all AAA games are $60 plus a $25 season pass. At $30, the self-published game by Ninja Theory had excellent production values. Impressive faces, environments, amazing sound, everything the modern high-spec game is expected to have. While there was a lot of asset reuse with a total of only about 5 non-boss enemies, and good use of lighting to mask their constant reuse of the same doors, bridges, and walkways, the game made up for it with a compelling story that used classic mythology as framework for a personal tale of insanity, depression, and loss. While the gameplay was simple, it worked for the most part, and sometimes one perfected simple concept is better than excess choices. Nier Automata was probably the year's biggest surprise hit, but not for anyone who played the first Nier game and is a fan of Platinum Games. Nier was a game with everything going for it except a bit of late PS3 era lag and some gameplay awkwardness. I personally thought from the sheer amount of bad and mediocre reviews that it was an outright bad game, until I heard from a reliable source, thanks Best Friends Play, some more details about it. Automata takes the brains behind the story, the voice behind the music, and the gameplay behind Bayonetta and Devil May Cry for what might be the best dream team in gaming, except for the cancelled Silent Hills. The gameplay is so much better than the first, it's unbelievable. Combat is so natural and intuitive that it's just like moving around, and fighting feels like swimming, in a good way. There are various gameplay formats and genres even, and they all play great. Automata is one of the best examples of narrative through gameplay I've ever seen, with error messages showing and graphics downgrading as characters' physical states break down. The plot is deep and layered, and is clearly intended to be played multiple times for reasons that I won't go into, but it's sort of reverse foreshadowed. Things later on in the game give you a different context and meaning for things that happen in the first half. If you start a new game, even the very first line of dialogue packs an emotional punch that's different than your first time through. There's a constant motif of philosophy that shows up again and again. Most of the machines are named after notable philosophers. Most of the important story elements and bosses have some kind of philosophical element to them. And then there's the primary antagonists, Adam and Eve, who read books and eat apples to become more like humans. The full game has 26 endings, though only 5 of them are necessary for the full experience of the game. And the last ending really is something that you have to experience rather than watch. Without spoiling anything, because even a single detail is a huge spoiler, it's completely unlike the rest of the game in any way, and is more like a social experiment that will connect you to people all around the world in a sort of sympathetic journey. In short, Nier Automata is a story about robots finding humanity, something timeless that is backed up by its gameplay, and the only thing stopping this from being an eternal classic are the online components that'll eventually go down one day. Ironically, one of the most compelling parts of the game at the very end. Lastly, I have a runner-up. Muv-luv Alternative is a visual novel, which some people don't consider to be games, plus it was originally published in Japan in 2006, but finally made it here in September thanks to Kickstarter. But including the first 2 parts of the trilogy from last year, it might be what I've put the most time and interest into out of any game this year, so it makes it onto this list as a sort of bonus. For those who've never heard of it, which I'm assuming is everyone, it ranked as the highest rated visual novel of all time for several years. There's a lot of hugely successful anime such as Fate Stay Night, Steins Gate, When They Cry, and Clannad that are based on visual novels, so that's quite impressive for something nobody outside of Japan has heard of. Though it did have 2, at best mediocre, anime spin-offs, Total Eclipse and Schwarz's Marken. Anyway, while the first part of the trilogy was a 3 out of 5 school harem comedy, Alternative is one of the best works of any kind of fiction I've ever experienced. It somehow pulls off a sudden genre shift into hard military sci-fi. There's geopolitical intrigue, war room strategy, battlefield tactics, and I'm gonna say, without hyperbole, the strongest character development I've ever seen. As I played through, I sympathized with the main character, someone from a peaceful world who saw others' refusal to question orders and willingness to sacrifice themselves on a whim and couldn't understand it, blowing it off as stupid. But through the course of the story, seeing events unfold, watching characters die, and beginning to understand what was going on in the background more, as his attitude changed, so did mine. This story was told so well that it managed to emotionally manipulate me into challenging a core belief of mine, this anti-authoritarian attitude that says you should question everything. Of course, this was just during the game and I wasn't brainwashed or something, but the point is that I didn't feel any disbelief. In fact, my thoughts were very much in line with his. That's something only an extremely good writer can do, which is why you never see fiction written second person. You need to synchronize the reader's emotion with the characters. Much like Nier Automata, there's some reverse foreshadowing of the trilogy. Finish Alternative, go back and play the first one, and you'll notice that some sound effects used with the fandom referred to as the PTSD sound. Important characters show up as minor ones, and their roles are similar, if not identical. Even though the original release was more than 10 years ago, it still holds up as one of the highest production value visual novels out there. There might be 1 or 2 that can compare, but these robot fights with what are essentially paper dolls are wonderfully scripted and animated, with occasional anime cutscenes. Well, this was way longer than expected, so if you stuck it through to the end, congratulations. Thanks for watching, and you might be interested in my other videos, in which case, you probably know how to subscribe. Like if you like, and I'll see you next year.